Greetings and welcome to the United States Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon. My name is Gennady Stoliarov II, and I am the chairman of the U.S. Transhumanist Party. Here we hold conversations with some of the world's leading thinkers in longevity, science, technology, philosophy, and politics. Like the philosophers of the Age of Enlightenment, we aim to connect every field of human endeavor and arrive at new insights to achieve longer lives, greater rationality, and the progress of our civilization. Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the first United States Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon of 2022. Congratulations to everyone in our audience because you survived 2021. Not everybody was so fortunate. We lost Betty White on December 31st, 2021 at the age of 99. Unfortunately, she was 3 weeks short of her 100th birthday. And of course, humanity lost a lot of people to the COVID-19 pandemic in 2021. So I think today's conversation will be important because we will be discussing prospects for the future of transhumanism and how we can make transhumanism as effective as possible in capturing the imagination of the public and also being accurately perceived by the public so that we can create a transhumanist future in which these kinds of tragedies are a lot rarer at the very least. We have an excellent panel for you today, including our Director of Visual Art, Art Ramon Garcia, our Director of Scholarship, Dan Elton, our Legislative Director, Jason Geringer, our Director of Applied Innovation, David Shoemaker, our Director of Longevity Outreach, Ben Ballweg, our Northern California Liaison, Celeste Castaldo, our member and founder of the Human Achievement Alliance, Dr. Edward Hudgens, our technology advisor and foreign ambassador in Spain, Dr. Jose Cordero, and our special guest for today is a returning guest whom many of our longtime viewers know well. He is David Wood. We had an excellent virtual enlightenment salon with David in 2021 on July 18th with regard to his book, Vital Foresight, The Case for Active Transhumanism. David Wood was one of the pioneers of the smartphone industry. He is now a futurist writer, consultant, and speaker. He spent 25 years designing, implementing, and avidly using smart mobile devices, including 10 years with pioneering PDA manufacturer Psion PLC, and 10 more with smartphone operating system specialist Symbian Limited, which he co-founded in 1998. At different times, his executive responsibilities included software development, technical consulting, partnering, and ecosystem management, and research and innovation. By 2012, his software for UI and application frameworks had been included on 500 million smartphones from various companies, and he has also been the chair of London Futurists, where he has organized over 200 public meetings since March 2008 on futurist and techno-progressive topics. And of course, David is also the co-founder of our allied organization, Transhumanist UK, which is our counterpart in the United Kingdom. So it's always a pleasure to have you as our guest, David, and we understand you prepared a special presentation for us today on the transhumanist shadow. So, David, you have the floor.
Many thanks. It's a real honor to be here, and it's great that we have indeed all made it into 2022. So my topic today is the transhumanist shadow. I'm going to be explaining what it is, why it's something that's important, and then offering some ideas on how we can dispel it so it's no longer a problem for the transhumanist movement. In brief, the transhumanist shadow is what I would see as regrettable aspects of the extended transhumanist movement. That's a lot of the fellow travelers and other people that media might, in some cases unfairly, mix in with transhumanism. Aspects which obscure the key messages of transhumanism, a bit like some of the text is obscured by the gray on this slide. And it causes observers to wrongly reject our movement because they misunderstand what we're really about. They see the shadow, they don't see the actual essence of the movement because of this misrepresentation. So what do I mean by transhumanism? I'll spend some time explaining that, and then I'll point out the ways in which the transhumanist shadow detracts from that and confuses it. In the first place, I see transhumanism in the nearly 2 decades that I've been looking at it as a profound and useful way of thinking about the world, thinking about progress, thinking about risks, and thinking about possible future scenarios. But transhumanism is more than just thinking, it's a set of actions. And I'll be saying more later on about the actions which transhumanists are taking and which I believe we should be taking more. Actions to help people discern these possible future scenarios more clearly, actions to help people, organizations, society as a whole to revise priorities, and actions indeed to build the better future that we believe is within our grasp. As for the word transhumanism, I quite like this simple definition that my friend in the UK, Tony Zarneski, has offered. Transhumanism anticipates the likelihood of a radical transition in the human condition, a transition that we sometimes say moves from H to H+. Now, radical transitions rarely run smoothly, and it is indeed likely there will be a fairly extended period of chaos and turbulence, which is already underway and which is likely to accelerate because of the drivers of this change, which is new technology. The technologies of the fourth industrial revolution, nanotech, biotech, infotech, and cognitech, and increasingly the forthcoming technologies of the fifth industrial revolution, artificial general intelligence. But if all goes well, this period of chaos and turbulence will eventually subside into a new level of stability and growth, in which we have uplifted and enhanced the most important aspects of human nature, and we have left behind many of the ages-old limitations and constraints. To be clear, this is no simple transition. It's no mere change in peripheral aspects of human livelihoods like people stopping working in farms and working in factories instead. It's more than people moving to a new part of the world or purchasing new electronic gadgets. What transhumanism anticipates is a much more profound transition. And it can be described in various ways, and it's by no means a closed destination. But one of the possible scenarios that could be enabled by wise use of emerging technologies is sometimes described as a 5S civilization. Super longevity. We take advantage of nanotech and biotech to enable lives that are much longer and healthier. Super intelligence. We take advantage of infotech and cognitech so that we can all think more clearly, more creatively, more accurately, with less cognitive bias and with less prejudice. We take advantage of various technologies so that our emotional states can be described as super happiness. We will be emotionally kinder, more joyous, less egocentric, less prone to depression, more enlightened. The fourth S is a reconfiguration of our social relationships into what can be called super democracy, in which society is less deceptive, less exploitative, more supportive, more diverse, and more collaborative. And the fifth S, sometimes described as superabundance, it's a transformation in humans' relationship with nature and the wider cosmos, which is for mutual sustainable benefit. So that's one of the visions, which could take place in as few as perhaps 2 or 3 decades. But it's by no means inevitable. And transhumanism recognizes that these more powerful technologies pose major risks as well as major opportunities. And there already are major risks, which I won't belabor. We don't have time to go into all of these, but we could talk about the ways in which technology supervises surveillance systems, making them more powerful and more intrusive. It supervises weapon systems, making them more trigger happy with lethal autonomous weapon systems, which is prone, as we know, as all technology is, as all software is, to bugs, which could be very deadly. Technology also makes some industries and some large corporations more powerful. And that's fine so long as these corporations have their objectives truly aligned with the well-being of humanity. But sometimes there are divergences, as, for example, the US President Eisenhower warned everybody about in his 1961 farewell address when he said, "Beware the military-industrial complex." And there are other such complexes which could become more powerful and more dangerous with misuse of technology, whether it's big tobacco, big oil, big pharma, big technology generally. The same technologies which give us the possibility for rejuvenation biotechnology could also, in the wrong hands or with mistaken use, lead to terrible bioweapons and neurotoxins, worse, far worse than the COVID outbreak. And through a pursuit of efficiency, through a pursuit of progress, we might end up with monocultures in our IT systems, monocultures in our financial relationships, which are prone to hacking or prone to other weaknesses. And the last I'll put on this list is the risk that more and more people see others apparently benefiting from technology, but feel they are themselves being left behind, with lower salaries than they had expected, with poorer qualities of life than they had expected. And in some cases, the violence that they inflict is not just on themselves, but potentially on much wider society. So transhumanism sees this and says, in my view, that it is vital to harness the acceleration of technology, steering it towards the desirable outcomes, sometimes applying brakes to some of the technological possibilities, and sometimes indeed encouraging even faster development. So to summarize what I've said so far, is the transhumanist context for our thinking and action in the 2020s and beyond. And I'll offer 4 points on this slide, and then I'll build it up to a total of what I see as 13 core points in my advocacy of active transhumanism. The first is the context of radical opportunity. The near future can be much better than the present situation. And that's what more people around the world need to understand. The human condition can be radically improved, as shown in that picture, compared to what we've inherited from evolution and history, hence the 5S civilization possibility. Equally, there is existential danger. The near future could be much worse than the present situation. Misuse of powerful technology could have catastrophic consequences, a new dark age or worse. Now, transhumanism itself doesn't assign probabilities to these different outcomes, but as a personal viewpoint, I think it's about 60% probable that by the middle of this century, 2050, we will have successfully managed these technologies and we'll be living in something akin to a 5S civilization. But it's also about 30% likely that we will have bungled that transition and we will be bitterly regretting what happened, assuming we're still alive and still able to think. Now, the difference between these two scenarios, the critical difference, is human agency, wise human thinking, and concerted human action. And the converse of that is there are no easy options here. If humanity gives too little attention to these radical future options on account of distraction or poor understanding, incomprehension, or intimidation, just being lack of courage, there's a high likelihood of a radically bad outcome. So that's the context in which all my following remarks depend. But what is the transhumanist answer? What are we saying beyond just, hey, we could reach H+? What is the true north that we want to identify? And this is where our critics often paint us wrongly, in my view. Sometimes people say that transhumanist is all about getting as much technology as possible, or living as long lives as possible, or promoting as much intelligence as possible, or efficiency, or happiness. And all of these are indeed important to transhumanists, but I don't see any of them as actually being our true north. To use that phrase, I offer instead the word well-being. And to explain what I mean by that, I think that in all our choices, people should prefer actions that are likely to lead to the increase of human well-being. And I acknowledge that it's a bit of a loose word and that it's not completely cut and dried how we should measure it or even how to improve it. And this is an ongoing conversation, but we have some clear ideas. Well-being depends and involves the things I've written there. Vitality, liberty, creativity, health, intelligence, awareness, happiness, collaboration, and bliss. And over time, our understanding of the conditions and possible expressions of well-being will evolve and improve. But we're not completely open. There are a couple of things that I think are paramount and need to be emphasized in their own right. In this vision of well-being, individuals matter incredibly importantly. Individual well-being should never be sacrificed or subordinated in favor of some kind of collectivist goals. Individuals should never become cannon fodder in service of some tribal or national or ethnic or religious or ideological quest. Now, that was often assumed in the past. People were told, you have to die for your country, you have to die for your cause, you have to die for your religion. And I think transhumanism utterly rejects all these notions. These are part of earlier worldviews that must now be left behind. And alongside this paramount importance of individual well-being is a recognition that we are actually mutually dependent. It's in our mutual interest to protect and elevate all members of society. I recently became a grandparent for the first time, and I was reminded of the wise saying, it takes a village to raise a child. We are intrinsically social beings. We are stronger together as transhumanists as well as humans, rather than in isolation or in a state of war. So these are our goals, but I also want to highlight a number of other important values which can be described as the means by which transhumanism wishes to emphasize these goals and get to this 5S civilization. So number 8 on this list of 13 is science, data, and rationality. We are not determined by what famous pundits or celebrities say, and instead we understand the importance of seeking, publishing, and reviewing objective data, respecting the best scientific principles. And one of these scientific principles is that of openness, but it's worth calling that out separately. You know, we can respect various books or thinkers or traditions because they are on the whole useful, but none of them act as some kind of infallible scripture or pope or something of that sort. Good track records often fail, especially in new circumstances. And the third thing I'll list here, a third core attribute of transhumanist means, is that of proactive vigilance. Yes, we should think ahead about possible consequences of what we do, but we should expect the unexpected. The circumstances in which we live will be complicated. The technologies will have unexpected consequences sometimes. The social implications of these technologies will also sometimes be surprises to us. So therefore, we should aim to be reversible where possible. And in anticipation of possible deviations from the original plan, we should be designing for change rather than with certainty in mind. So to recap again, I've highlighted a number of values of active transhumanism, the context, the core goals, the means championed. And if I had more time, I would dig into the final three on this list, which are generalizations and extensions, sustainability, thinking not just of the present, but also of the conditions for future flourishing, thinking not just about human flourishing, but very importantly, the flourishing of all consciousness, including relevant animals, including the well-being of post-humans, and where appropriate, the well-being of any AIs that become conscious. And the final generalization recognizes that if you do all the things that I've listed there, there are still many choices left open. And we should celebrate that. We should celebrate and embrace diversity because we are stronger as a result. So these are our values. What are the transhumanist projects that I referred to share our thinking? I think a lot of it is education, a bit like this wonderful series of virtual enlightenment salons. We are seeking to explain the consequences of NBIC technologies and the forthcoming consequences of AGI, explaining the possible scenarios that arise. But it's not just ideas, it's politics, it's actions, it's getting involved to build alliances with people who can accelerate our goals in various ways. It's alliances to counter some of the dangerous tendencies I mentioned before, and it's accelerating application of resources, both private resources and public resources, to the most important beneficial projects. And then I need to call out one more activity. That's the activity of advocacy. And that's what I'm going to spend the rest of my remarks on. Advocacy that counters misunderstandings, sometimes willful misunderstandings of transhumanism, and also advocacy to dispel this transhumanist shadow that I have been leading up to talking about. So now let me answer the question, why, despite all the eminent good ideas and values in transhumanism, why does it only still in 2022 have limited public support? And I will offer three reasons. First, there is still a limited understanding of our ideas and our projects. Although there are an increasing number of books about transhumanism and films, we need much more. So the projects for education and advocacy, which include not just intellectual education, but cultural education, artistic education, fiction as well. Then, as I hinted, there are deliberate distortions of what we stand for. Many people who attack transhumanism have got their own ideological axes to grind. In some cases, not all, but in some cases, people are driven by some unfortunate psychological tendencies, we might say inner demons. And the result of all this is that many of the criticisms which people pick up in the general public discussion are unfair or confused. I devote a whole chapter of my book, the 12th chapter, to these criticisms that I consider are generally confused or unfair. I don't have time to dig into any just now, although I'm happy to come back in the Q&A section. People consider that transhumanism is guilty of scientism or technocracy or totalitarianism, that we're utopian or divisive, we're guilty of wishful thinking, neo-colonial, that we're an unnecessary thing, that we got the wrong name, that we're really a religion in disguise, and so forth. As I said, there's a lot to discuss there, and we might come back to it in the Q&A. But I want to focus the remainder of my remarks on the shadow, which is some criticisms that have an element of context and substance to them. They point to behaviors of some people in the general transhumanist community, and it suggests to them that some transhumanists are naive or selfish or dangerous. And the shadow is actually the kind of opposite of some of these values. In principle, there are 13 elements of the shadow, just as there are 13 values, though in practice, I want to concentrate on 8. So if we look at point 2, existential danger, some people in the general transhumanist community downplay that and say, well, the risks, don't worry, we'll take them in our stride. As for human agency, some people say, no, we don't need humans to do something special. Technology or some other grand cosmic rule will determine the outcome. In terms of a general understanding of human well-being, sometimes transhumanists are seen, mainly wrongly, as not being fond of biology and seeking to escape from biology. Then we could talk about egocentric transhumanism, which downplays mutual responsibility. We could talk about solution hyping, which fails to apply principles of science, data, and rationality properly. We can talk about solution dogmatism, which closes minds and lacks openness. We can talk about anti-regulation fundamentalism, which fails to follow the principles of proactive vigilance. And last one on this list is monoculture transhumanism, as opposed to celebrating diversity. So I will dig briefly into some of these, starting with technological determinism, which is sometimes summarized in this rather fine picture. It says the victory of transhumanism is inevitable. It's a great work of art, and it inspires people, but it downplays, in my view, the actual responsibility of humans. It suggests that there are bigger forces of history at play, a little bit like transhumanists therefore don't have much to do apart from cheerleading and giving each other thumbs up and liking. It's a bit like Marxists used to be. They talked about the inevitable proletarian revolution and the expropriation of the expropriators. They said, as an iron law of history, it's a bit like some religious visions of messianic intervention. When people look at various prophecies from Holy Scriptures and imagine, yes, there's going to be a rapture, or we can follow the messianic leaders on the plains of Armageddon or some other battlefields. This may be psychologically appealing to people whose lives have been suffering, whose people have been unhappy and depressed. And indeed, a lot of the transhumanist shadow has a psychological appeal of a sort. But in each case, I believe it's misleading, it's dangerous, it's irresponsible, it's enfeebling, it's disempowering. And I claim if we actually look at history, we will find that real history is much more complicated than technology determining the outcomes. Instead, two different societies with access to the same technologies can develop in very different ways, depending on political and social choices made, depending on the actual cultures. So rather than technological determinism, I believe transhumanists are all about human determinism. We humans will take advantage of technology, but we will definitely harness it and steer it. So we will make predictions about possibilities, but not be led astray by specific actions at specific dates, unless we're talking about astronomical convergences. Anything involving the complexities of human culture cannot be predicted so precisely. So we're talking about probabilities and possibilities. And yes, we can talk about desirable or undesirable outcomes, but we have to recognize there are forecasts have elements of uncertainty involved. So we need to be better, not just at forecasting, but being able to adapt swiftly to new developments. Let's move on to solution dogmatism. This is dogmatism not just about the outcome, but according to the methods that various people are obsessed about and say before transhumanism does anything else, it must do X or Y or Z. And there are different flavors of it. In some cases, people are really obsessed with the idea of genetic determinism, that the most important determinant of human well-being isn't our philosophy, it's not social interactions, it's our genes, and we should be using our genetic editing capabilities. That's the most important thing. A different flavor says that before we do anything else, we must dismantle capitalism because capitalism has got these bad aspects. And yet another flavor says before we do anything else, we should be abolishing money or abolishing fiat money because there are detrimental aspects to, the mechanisms of fractional reserve banking. And all of these cases, they may be sympathetic to transforming society with technology, but in all these cases, I believe their minds are too closed, and they will cause us to miss the best opportunity. They will cause us to miss the complications. Of course, genes determine things a lot, but there are many other determinants. Even in the level of biology, there are many other levels of biology which determine people's health. And yes, there are drawbacks to some aspects of capitalism, but it'd be very foolish to dismantle capitalism in its entirety without reforming it first. And it's the same with finance. So to achieve the future we desire, we must be wary of solution dogmatism, and instead it's solution openness that I believe characterizes the true transhumanist approach. Now let's look at one special case of solution dogmatism, which is anti-regulation fundamentalism. And the view here is whatever else transhumanists should be doing, we should be resisting regulation of the economy. Why? It's so that entrepreneurs and engineers will be allowed a free rein to make progress as fast as they would like. And this idea is tied up with a story of history that the true heroes are entrepreneurs and engineers, and the villains are usually the politicians or the regulators who slow things down due to their poor understanding. And you can find some elements of history in which that is the case, no doubt. But it's a narrow reading of history. And you can also point to cases where public health initiatives have saved millions of lives. You can point to cases when well-meaning entrepreneurs and engineers nevertheless introduce products with significant safety issues. And you can point to cases of very powerful companies that initially were highly innovative, but as they became monopolies, they resisted innovation and restricted disruptions and became force for stasis rather than forces for growth. So there are roles for regulation. Indeed, it's not always technology that's the best way to address particular problems. Sometimes a political change can be much more effective. So I say we should beware addiction to techno-solutionism, and even where the technology is the best solution, it sometimes is most effectively delivered by a government's industrial strategy, positive political direction. To be clear, I'm not saying we need lots more politicians or lots more regulators. I'm talking about quality rather than quantity. I'm talking about championing better politics and better regulation. I'm talking about proactive vigilance, keeping an eye on things, including things where we think we know what's going to happen, but we might still be surprised. Now let's talk about the shadow aspect of solution hyping. And this emerges when there are potentially lots of money to be made by selling therapies or treatments, which could extend lifespans, which could increase intelligence, which could sharpen mental concentration, which could strengthen emotional bonds. To be clear, I believe there are compounds, therapies, treatments that can do all of these things and which have good evidence. That's not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about cases where there are, we would call them rogue products, products without good evidence, products which are sometimes deliberately oversold by people who actually know better, or they can be naive overselling, people who haven't actually grasped the essence of scientific method. They think they have done some research, but actually they haven't. And the drawbacks of such overhyping are threefold. First, many people could be damaged in terms of actual health problems as a result of using therapies which are dangerous for them personally. Even if there is no health danger, there could be a lot of money wasted on ineffectual goods and services. And the broader point is that if we transhumanists are perceived as being naive or foolish in our endorsement of various products, then it's bad for our reputation as a whole. Once again, I emphasize, I'm not complaining about all our advocacy of all products. There are plenty of good and wholesome and well-evidenced products, but sometimes we are just too careless, some of us, in what we endorse. So instead of solution hyping, we must remind ourselves of the principles of science, data, and rationality, which are hard, but this is the method we need to truly get us into a better future. Now let me talk about egocentric transhumanism. It's an apparent lack of concern for unequal access to the fruits of technology. There's a kind of trickle-down philosophy here that says that the technology will start off in a not very good form and will be used by some vanguard early adopters and will eventually be accessed by everyone. And in a way, I think that's correct. I think that is how we're going to get to abundance. But there is a very awkward, turbulent transitional period before we get there. There will be a period in which many of these treatments are not widely available, and people further down this hierarchy perceive themselves to be falling behind, and especially if it seems to them that those at the top are callous, grasping, and self-seeking, it could generate all kinds of harm, adversity, anguish, and hostility, which could lead people to sabotage many of the projects that are very important to transhumanism. So instead of egocentric transhumanism, we must emphasize the value of mutual responsibility. Instead of ever giving the impression that transhumanism is primarily for the 1%, it's not something any of us would ever say, but sometimes that impression might be picked up from our remarks. Instead, we are emphasizing transhumanism for all. Related to this, not egocentric transhumanism, I want to talk about monoculture transhumanism. That's when individual transhumanist enthusiasts show concerns for other people who are sufficiently similar to themselves, but they are apparently disinterested or even antagonistic to other potential supporters of transhumanist principles who have different backgrounds, different primary or secondary aspirations, or different ways of expressing themselves. If we were to live like that, as a movement, we will be weaker because we will be cutting ourselves off from the insights and experience and the connections and the talents of that wider potential pool. So instead of monoculture transhumanism, in which the growth of our movement is slower and stymied, I emphasize the value of embracing diversity. Just 2 points left on this list of 8. The loathing of biology is perhaps a minority issue, but sometimes technology enthusiasts are perceived at finding aspects of their biological existence to be distasteful or limiting, that they concentrate on ideas for transferring their minds as soon as possible out of biology into alternative hardware substrates, such as a cloud of silicon and computers. And this was a theme in quite an interesting TV series of a couple of years ago. It was shown on HBO as well as the BBC, years and years. There was a character in this, Bethany, who came out as a transhuman. And there was a bit of discussion about whether that meant she was transgender or not. But she said, no, no, no. What I want to do is live forever as information. So there's the idea of leaving biology behind and being information. Now, in my view, transhumanism is a much richer understanding of well-being. As I said, we talk about vitality, liberty, creativity, health, awareness, happiness, collaboration, and bliss, as well as information. Finally, perhaps more controversially, I want to talk about risk complacency. It's when some members of the extended transhumanist community focus on the potential large upsides of new technologies, but giving only lip service to the potential large downsides. And they may say things like this: famines, runaway climate change, nanotechnology, grey goo, global pandemics. We've heard all that before. We've heard it so many times. It's never happened. We don't need to worry about these risks. But of course, the same thing could be said about the positive things that transhumanism looks forwards to. We look forward to super longevity. It hasn't come yet. We look forward to super intelligence. That hasn't come yet. No, what we are talking about is not certainties, it's probabilities. And we're talking about changing from linear thinking to exponential thinking, in which good things might multiply, but bad things might, in some circumstances, multiply too, as sadly we have seen with this global pandemic, in which one bad variant seemingly gives rise to another troubling variant as well. And there are knock-on consequences with lockdowns and economical problems. So we need to have a more sophisticated understanding of the dangers and a different attitude towards risk management. There are some in the transhumanistic community that says, well, yes, but risk management is likely to be counterproductive. There are 3 drawbacks to risk management. First, it will cause a slowdown. It will cause resources to be turned away from innovative technologies. It will mean people won't do genetic research as quickly as possible that might get us cures more quickly. It will mean that AGI might be restricted. It will delay important breakthroughs. Even worse, if politicians get involved, because politicians generally impose foolish restrictions. So we better not mention this to politicians. And especially we better not get this discussed at the United Nations, because then we'll get an even more stultifying global bureaucracy in the way of important breakthroughs. And each of these concerns are legitimate. I think these are important worries. But they're not the whole story either. So I say that transhumanists need the precautionary principle and the proactionary principle. We transhumanists need the true form of both of these principles. The precautionary principle says that before trying something which could be very disastrous, we need to learn as much as possible before getting involved. And the proactionary principle says, yes, but we will also learn as we go about things. Now, we could spend a long time talking about these 2 principles. I will just say that I cover them more in a couple of other videos that you can find on the vital syllabus area of London Futurists, some on the singularity, and some on landmines generally, which are things that could go wrong with society. Where I talk about the difference between harm and ruin. Harm is when you might get 1, 2, 3, or maybe 4 sigma deviations from the expectations. Ruin is when you get fat tail distributions and you end up with 20 or 30 sigma away from what you expected and totally destroy the possibility of recovery. But anyway, let me now draw to conclusion. I've talked about the transhumanist shadow. I've picked 8 of the 13 elements of the core transhumanist values and said, if we fail to live up to them, or if people in our general community, as perceived by critics, fail to live up to them, it damages the perception of transhumanism. The way to solve this is to emphasize these values more fully, with better explanations, and with a richer narrative. So to summarize, the way to dispel the transhumanist shadow is that we clarify these positive values via education, via advocacy, via narratives that are credible, inspiring, engaging, and inclusive. But it's not just a matter of education, it's a matter of demonstrating these positive values, that we walk the talk, that we apply practical transhumanism here and now to the extent that's possible, so that when people look at us as a community, they will say, actually, these people really are concerned for the well-being of all society. They have the right balance of vision for the opportunities and risks. They are people we should listen to. They are people whose projects we should support. And that leads me to wind up. I want to thank you for having listened, and I hand back now to Gennady, and I look forward to interactions.
Thank you very much, David, for an excellent presentation. I think our panel and our audience enjoyed it greatly as well. And Peter Zing has joined us in the chat. Of course, to everybody in our community, Peter Zing is well known as one of the founders of Transhumanism Australia. We had him as a previous Virtual Enlightenment Salon guest, and he says this is an amazing talk and that it is great to see the community here too. I would like to echo that sentiment from Peter. Also, I would like to remind everybody of David's YouTube channel, which contains the vital syllabus, including a large number of videos that he has created already. Please, everybody, go to David's YouTube channel and subscribe. Hopefully, we can have a vibrant conversation today about the subjects that David presented, including the transhumanist shadow and how we could overcome those misperceptions that David pointed out. Now, Mike DeVerde, our longtime member and CEO of the Washington State Transhumanist Party, writes that David's YouTube video on the transhumanist shadow was great, and he would like you, David, to describe the turbulent transition that you discuss in the segment on unequal distribution and the trickle down of benefits. I understand that, of course, we live in turbulent times right now. Do you believe that our present experience is part of this turbulent transition? And if so, how far along are we in that transition? Is it going to ramp up, or is it going to wind down if we hypothetically emerge out of the COVID-19 pandemic? Will it likely be smooth sailing from there, or are we due for a lot more turbulence, even if the end result is going to be highly beneficial?
So one consequence of the technologies that are so dominant today is that they tend to have a winner takes all nature. The ones that are successful tend to drive out second tier or third tier competitors, and they end up being incredibly dominant in the world in a way that didn't used to be the case. If you compare the largest companies in Silicon Valley today with the largest companies in Detroit, maybe 25 or 30 years ago, there were many more employees in these Detroit companies, Ford and General Motors and Chrysler. But the valuation of the Silicon Valley companies is much, much higher, much higher than the revenues. And it sort of makes sense. So there is a tendency, if we're not careful, for the very wealthy companies to become even more wealthy. And there's a tendency for more people who thought they were doing reasonably well in society to suddenly find that they are no longer employable, or to find that they can't get as much salary as they were expecting. So more and more people, I think, might perceive themselves as being left behind, or even if they are economically well off, they will feel that the apparent elites might disdain them, to view them as, quote, deplorable or disposable. And it will lead some of them to get depressed, as we have seen from the sad statistics of deaths of despair, in which people are living shorter lives in some demographics. This is even before the advent of COVID. And I think this is no accident. We're seeing people living poorer qualities of life with bad diet, with bad exercise, but they're also becoming addicted to opioids and alcohol, and they're letting themselves be misled by unhelpful narratives about the causes of their predicaments, and they're getting angry and disillusioned, and many of them kill themselves directly or indirectly, and a small subset want to cause damage to the society that they see is responsible for their predicament. Now, I do think that we will shortly have enough for everyone. This is the vision of sustainable superabundance. But many people won't believe that. Many people are already psychologically disposed to fear what the apparent elites say. And this is one cause of vaccine hesitancy. It's not just something intellectual. It's a disregard, a dislike, a fear of what medical authorities seem to have said in the past. So the only way to fix this, well, of course, we must engage intellectually, but we must also demonstrate a few things. We must demonstrate, for example, that vaccines will be available to everybody who wants them around the world and will not be hoarded just by the rich world. We must demonstrate that people are not above the law. There is the perception in the left behinds that the elites get away with all kinds of bad behavior, that there is one law of justice for most people and another law of justice for the elites. We must demonstrate that the voices in society can be accessed by everyone and aren't just for those who happen to be skilled in manipulating. So we have to show something better. Otherwise, there is the risks that even as technologies for radical enhancement become closer, more people will be stirring up hatred and disdain of this. And more people will be saying, we don't want this. We want to live allegedly simpler, more natural lives without 5G, without mechanization, in which people are true to principles of, I don't know, the Bible or other religious textbooks. And that worry is there, and we're going to address it partly, as I've said, by advocacy, but partly also by demonstrating that actually we are quick to distribute the fruits of technology here and now as much as possible.
Thank you very much for that response, David. And we've had great feedback from our audience thus far. First of all, I would like to acknowledge everyone's generous contributions via the super chats. First, to our Northern California liaison, Celeste Castaldo, thank you very much for your contribution. John H. says his contribution is starting the new year off right, and this event is starting the new year off right as well. Alan Crowley echoes this. He says, good idea, John. And Dan Elton, thank you as well. He says, Happy New Year, everyone. Let's make 2022 the year longevity and transhumanism go mainstream. It's precisely why I wanted to invite David today to have this conversation. And one of our supporters, John H., points out transhumanism doesn't represent a break from what has always been part of the human project, which is to make life as satisfying as possible. He wants us to discuss this, and he adds, parents have been saying since forever that they want to leave their children living in a better world than they experience themselves. I would add, as a transhumanist, I want to keep living in a better world than I have experienced in the past. And in many significant respects, life has improved considerably since I was a child. In other respects, there has been some regression, particularly since 2015 and especially since 2020. But I hope we can break that tendency. But the broader point that John makes is extremely apt. Ever since the invention of basic tools in the Paleolithic era, ever since the harnessing of fire for useful purposes, humans have strived to overcome their limitations by the use of technology, be it through occasional ad hoc experimentation or in later eras through the scientific method and more systematic kinds of projects. And David, would you agree that communicating this understanding that transhumanism doesn't represent a radical break from the past, but is essentially continuous with our fundamental human nature, would help to bring more members of the public to an acceptance of transhumanism, or at least not trying to combat it or discredit it?
I think that's a very important line of discussion, and John is right to emphasize some of the previous examples in which we have done better than what we inherited from nature, right from the beginning of human history, not just with fire, but also with the sling, in which we learned to carry, or women learned to carry young children wrapped up with a sling so it would free their arms to do more work. And indeed, throughout history, again and again, we have enhanced our abilities. What is different about the present time is the pace of change and the possibility of so much more change happening within just a couple of decades from what has previously been the case. And that deserves clarification as well. And many people still don't get this. Many people still imagine that by the middle of the century, we'll be doing broadly the same sort of things as today. And I think there's a very limited chance that that is the case. As I said, I think there's a 60% chance we'll be in a very much better circumstance, but also a 30% chance that we'll be in a very much worse circumstance, and only maybe a 10% chance that we're broadly the same as today. Why? It's because of the power that's being unleashed by these new technologies. So part of our transhumanist advocacy is an understanding of what's different today about biotech and cognitech, nanotech and infotech, and what's going to be different indeed in the next 10 or 20 years. And this will put so many more possibilities in our hands than before. So there's continuity, but also there's a radical acceleration, and both messages need to be introduced at the right time into the conversation.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, David, for those remarks. And Celeste Castaldo in our internal chat points out, we have seen a number of incurable diseases cured recently by stem cell and gene therapies. In California, so-called bubble baby disease was cured for a number of children, which was a result of a collaboration between taxpayer-led stem cell therapy in California and research at universities. There are also new reports of stem cell therapy having cured disease previously considered incurable, like type 1 diabetes. And I wonder if these kinds of successes are publicized to a greater extent, if people see diseases that were once considered either death sentences or at least consigning a person to a greatly reduced standard of living, all of a sudden being cured and the suffering being alleviated, do you think that would dramatically turn the tide in favor of an embrace of transhumanism, and people wouldn't try as hard as some of them do right now to figure out ways to criticize transhumanism or find downsides? Rather, they would be more open to the ideas because they see the practical benefits so clearly.
Well, and thanks to Celeste for these links. I haven't had a chance to keep up with all the news stories. I mean, that's another aspect of the accelerating times in which we live. There are so many new, interesting and exciting announcements like this the whole time. And I completely agree. We should find ways to ensure that people are aware of them, that they can understand, in a sense, this is under human control. It's giving humans incredible new possibilities. And at the same time, we must point out the ways in which the therapies will, as far as possible, become more widely available as time moves on. A lot of the stem cell therapies are still pretty expensive. A lot of the CRISPR reprogramming is incredibly expensive. But let's point out the mechanisms, the processes by which we expect these prices to come down so that more people will benefit. But yes, this will be good things to have people reflecting on in news stories, so that as we look at what's different between 2021 and 2022, there should be more of these remarkable good news stories.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for those responses, David. And Mikhail.com remarks, excellent presentation. He would love to hear more on the public perception and communication strategy. There is a lot of misinformation and distorted information circulating these days, and I would like to expand upon his observation as well. It seems that some of these aspects of the transhumanist shadow are noticed by critics, but instead of confining their criticism to those regrettable aspects that you point out, sometimes those critics take the transhumanist shadow aspects out of proportion and then use some valid seeds of criticism to unfairly tarnish the entire transhumanist movement. And sometimes there could even be particular individuals who really misunderstand transhumanism or really embody the transhumanist shadow, and they're cherry-picked by the critics, who will then point to them and say, see, this is what transhumanism is about, when in fact that rogue individual could be very much in the minority among transhumanists, and most of us are a lot more nuanced, and we see the complexities of the issues as you've articulated them, and yet the critics don't want to acknowledge that, particularly if they're sensationalistic media types who want to generate clickbait, or who follow the principle, if it bleeds, it leads. And they want to highlight the rogue personality. And those of us who are more level-headed don't get coverage from them, either because they don't think it will attract clicks or because our perspectives don't help them make their case against transhumanism. So how can we counter this? And what do you think are some promising approaches that would help create a more balanced view of transhumanism in the minds of conventional media consumers?
So one thing I learned in my decades in the mobile computing and smartphone industry is that there is a whole discipline of PR, of marketing communications, which is actually important. There are good ways and bad ways to communicate, and that people who rush in, who say things, can sometimes cause more harm than they intended. And so many times I worked with PR people in my career to help mold the message. So I brought my own ideas, but occasionally they would inspire me to better wording and better presentation means. So there are hard skills in PR and communications, and we must be willing to learn from people who actually do understand how this works. Having said that, I am in favor of trying multiple approaches. I'm not in favor of a monoculture of communications. I'm in favor of a diversity of communications. I think different people in the general public will respond to different messages. One of the principles of marketing communications, after all, is that people in the so-called majority tend to respond well to messages from people who appear to be like them. So if they see somebody who appears strange or different, they may not be that inclined to listen to them. But if they see people who they could imagine themselves being, people they evaluate as potentially their peers or people they would like to follow, then they are more open to listening to what they say. So we need to get our messages out then to a variety of different people, and they need to express it in language which makes sense for their own communities. To come back to the point that some of our critics are acting in bad faith. They're grabbing hold of anything they can to make transhumanism look bad, not because that's what really motivates them. They are doing it for their own purposes. Possibly it's to generate more clicks, it's to generate more anger. There are people whose business it is to make people angry and make people resentful, and to make them double down and join whatever community they are advocating themselves. And sometimes I interact with these people on Twitter, and I often wonder, am I wasting my time or not? I'm unlikely to persuade the actual instigators of these criticisms, but I do think sometimes that my remarks, which involve some of the things we've been talking about, as John H. was saying, pointing out that humans have enhanced themselves throughout all of history. When you say things like that, you won't convince the actual critics, but you may persuade some of the uncommitted bystanders. And so the uncommitted bystanders will have these ideas going in too. So there is a role for some engagement, but I am loath to spend too much time on it because you can never win these arguments with the instigators, usually because they are pursuing a different kind of vendetta altogether.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, David. Sometimes I have learned as well, the key in our communications is not to change the minds of the instigators. It is to affect the perceptions of the rest of the public, the potentially initially neutral observers whose future views of transhumanism will be affected by the kind of coverage they see, the kinds of arguments they hear presented. Along these lines, Sergei Gubkin writes that he is glad we are having this discussion as it debunks any idea that transhumanism is a conspiracy, a fraud, wishful thinking, narcissism, a pipe dream, psychosis, infantility, or pseudoscience. So yes, those are all criticisms we hear sometimes, uneducated, uninformed criticisms of transhumanism. And David has done an excellent job presenting a thoughtful, nuanced approach that really gets to the essence of what transhumanism is about. That is why we also have these virtual enlightenment salons, because we like to think about the future in a nuanced, interdisciplinary, inclusive way that considers how do we get to the best outcomes for humanity? How do we get to solutions to the persistent problems that have faced our species? And indeed, as David pointed out, the future is not guaranteed. We need to maximize our probability of reaching that beneficial set of outcomes and scenarios. And hopefully we can increase the 60% to 90% at least through our efforts, our human agency. Now, John H. makes an inquiry that I think we should delve into a little bit because I know both David and I have their views on this. He wonders, does anyone get the idea that maybe it was a mistake to call the project transhumanism in the first place, that it produced needless misgivings and gave adversaries a named target? And Daniel Twett does think that transhumanism seemed to invoke a lot of baggage. Now, my perspective has always been that transhumanism is the best, most objectively correct name for our movement, and probably any name would have gotten this kind of target on its back after being circulated in public sufficiently. Also, I have noticed throughout the years, there have been various attempts to rebrand the movement, and those attempts have failed. They haven't failed because the rebranded terms were bad in any way or created misperceptions. It's just with every new term, there's an uphill battle in even getting it recognized, getting it inserted into the discourse. And transhumanism does have a lot of traction to it, a lot of momentum to it, and a lot of recognition, which is positive. There are figures right now in academia, in media, even in politics, who have heard of the term transhumanism, who have reached out to our community, and who have provided reasonable and fair coverage of transhumanism using that name. The Transhumanist Party's founder in the United States, Zoltan Istvan, pointed out during his extensive experience with media, transhumanism has been the term that garnered the most attention, and that includes the most positive attention. But I'm wondering what your perspective on this is in terms of using transhumanism as the term to describe our movement and working to overcome the misconceptions rather than using rebranding to kind of deflect attention away from the misconceptions.
Well, I agree with everything you've just said there, Gennady. I think if we did change the name, many of the criticisms would still hang around. And the criticisms don't depend on the name. They depend on the things that I've talked about. You know, we are talking about radical changes, which people fear. We're talking about an acceleration of change, which people fear. And that's where the unhappiness derives from. Some people say trans means transgender, so we should give up on transhumanism, but there are many other words starting with trans, like transistor or transatlantic or transcendence, you know, so that's not a good reason to give up on that name. No, and transhumanism can be parsed in several different ways. It's talking about a transition in the human condition. It's talking about transcending aspects of human nature. So these names both make sense. So I've often been involved in discussions about changing the name, and I don't think they would help particularly. We can use other names as well. We can talk about Humanity Plus, as the World Transhumanist Association has been rebranded to. That is a good term. But the Humanity Plus also talks about transhumanism as the philosophy. It's not moving away from that. So this is diversity of communication strategy. And we can talk about extropy, and there's a lot to be said about the extropian principles, the documents that Max Moore wrote over a 20-year period, which actually more than 20 years, 30 years, which have a great deal of merit in them. So that's another term we can use, but it's not to diminish the use of transhumanism. I would keep that there.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, David. And I concur with you as well. Indeed, Mike Lezine points out, we did have a vote when the Transhumanist Party combined with the Transhuman Party and then the Longevity Party in the United States about what the name of the combined entity would be. And essentially, overwhelmingly, our members chose to retain the name Transhumanist Party. John H. writes that he agrees with the comments that have been made, and he notes pretty much any name would have drawn both support and adversity. And Mike Lazine points out Transformers is a commonly used term, and I don't think anybody considers Transformers to have anything to do with changing their gender identity. Our viewer CM Stewart writes that we need to make sure people know transhumanism is science-based, that we are discussing some radical scientific possibilities, but it is grounded in science. And I completely agree that's an important aspect of transhumanist messaging. And I know Dan Elton also has a follow-up comment on transhumanist messaging. So Dan, please proceed.
Yeah, it's more of a comment than a question, but I agree that we're sort of stuck with the term transhumanism, but I've talking to people like Zoltan Isfan and others who've been in transhumanism a long time. What I've heard is the tide is changing a bit, and right now a lot of people are reluctant to identify as a transhumanist because of the negative associations that have been promulgated, as you discussed. But from what I've heard, the tide is changing, and especially in countries outside of the United States, the term is being used more. But my comment was, I think branding is really important as well, because like right now, if you search for transhumanism on Google, you see a lot of images of like cyborgs, people with like cameras stuck in their eye and all this weird stuff. And I personally find that very off-putting. And I think there's a certain ick factor to that. So I'm just curious if you have any comments about, branding and, how we should basically brand our events and meetups and different educational things we're doing.
So branding is important. I agree. That's what I was trying to say earlier, that the PR and marketing communications is an important discipline in its own right. And if people do come up with something new, I'm willing to run with it a bit. So I have a podcast which I do with a couple of colleagues here in the UK, which is called Humanity Unshackled, just as a different line. But we use the word transhumanism a lot in the discussion of that, but that's an experiment. I also run a lot of my meetings under the umbrella of London Futurists, which is a more mainstream branding, if you like. Futurism gets its own questions and critics as well. Some people say anybody who describes himself as a futurist is a cretin and an idiot and should be despised, or words to that extent. But it's not as bad as the criticism that comes to transhumanism. So the one reason I do this is because I think a lot of the transhumanist messages can be portrayed in a setting that doesn't emphasize always the philosophy. It's more of the background. Hey, there is radical exponential change coming. Hey, we're going to need to think these things through more carefully from a values and ethics point of view, as well as simply a technological determinism point of view. So I'm willing to use multiple brands, but I don't see a reason to write transhumanism out of the script. And I think that although some people may want to move away from it, others will adopt it. And I want to encourage more people to adopt it. And that's what I put right in the front of my book. I think it says in almost the first page of this, I can read from it. It says, sorry, let me get the page here. There's too many pages at the front. Transhumanism, don't put that word on the cover of your book. That's the advice I received from a number of friends when they heard what I was writing about. They urge me to avoid the T word, transhumanism. The word has bad vibes, they said. It's toxic. T for toxic. I understand where they're coming from. Later in this book, I'll dig into reasons why various people are uncomfortable with the whole concept. I'll explain why I nevertheless see transhumanism as an apt term for a set of transformational ideas that will be key to our collective well-being in the 2020s and beyond. T for transformational, and yes, T for timely. As such, it's a word that belongs on the cover of many more books, inspiring more conversations, more realizations, and more breakthroughs. So I do look forward to more books being published with that on the cover. I look forward to more transhumanists being invited onto standard talk shows, not just on relatively small audience channels, but on mainstream channels. And as people see the word transhumanism associated with people who seem to be relatively normal, then I think the toxicity will decline and people will embrace it again.
Yeah, I agree 100%. And I've recently changed my view on this, just talking to people like Zoltan and also hearing people like Balaji Srinivasan, who's kind of a well-known futurist and prognosticator, say that, you know, more and more people will probably be identifying with that term. I think it is possible to sort of reclaim it and dispel some of those negative connotations.
Mm-hmm. Yes, indeed. And our friend Peter Zing points out in our chat that he and his colleagues who are managing the transhuman coin have experienced some success with using transhuman coin as an economic incentive for emerging markets to opt into the philosophy of transhumanism. He points out there are a lot of people who hold transhuman coin who now identify on social media as transhumanists, and a lot of them are in Africa and in either Nigeria or South Africa or other countries on that continent. Now, on the other hand, Ojochukwu Abdul, our foreign ambassador in Nigeria, writes that he has an issue with transhuman coin holders branding themselves on social media as transhumanists. And the reason why he has this issue is because they invest in the coin as they would in other coins while understanding little or nothing of transhumanist philosophy. So there is this issue sometimes. On the one hand, we are grateful to have new people interested and enthusiastic about transhumanism as a movement and as a philosophy. On the other hand, when you have growth that rapid, there is a risk of the message being diluted or people not really understanding what it's about. And there may even be a risk of entryism by certain more sophisticated actors who will use the large new influx and tailor messaging to the new entrants, essentially saying, well, no, this is what transhumanism is about. Transhumanism is about perhaps providing 10% more comfort to aging seniors in retirement homes, which is a good goal. But there is this risk that if the movement becomes too mainstream too quickly without people really understanding the ideas of transhumanism, that the message will become very diluted and less focused on the truly transformational promises of transhumanism. And I'm not saying that all or most transhuman coin holders are like that. I think there's a lot of genuine interest and enthusiasm among them, but education is so vital, as I'm sure, David, you would agree. So how do we make sure that the growth of our movement corresponds with the growth of public understanding about what transhumanism truly represents?
Well, I'll be interested to hear views from the other panelists on this. I'm sure they have all thought about this as well as me. try to write as much as I can to help people see transhumanism from multiple points of view. And I think when there is a community of people such as the transhuman coin holders growing rapidly, we have a special responsibility to find out the kinds of information that will be most helpful to them. And I know that Peter and others who are steering the transhuman coin community are actively thinking about that, finding ways that will convert that initially fairly uninformed embrace of transhumanism into something that is more solid.
Yes, indeed. And our friend Alan Crowley points out that the Enlightenment salons could be a great resource to direct new entrants to our movement towards, so that they do have the experience of learning about transhumanism, immersing themselves in this discussion. And I completely agree with him. There's no better approach to learning than immersion, than being in our community, participating in the many discussions that we have here, as well as in other venues like the London Futurists. Now I know our foreign ambassador in Spain, Jose Cordero, has some remarks that he would like to make. So Jose, you have the floor.
Hello, David. Always great to see you, to hear from you, and to learn from you. Congratulations on your new book and on your presentation. And my question is about the 5S civilization. When it began, really, it was like 2S. It was super longevity and super intelligence. Then people like David Pearce included super happiness or super well-being. Then you talked also about super democracy. And now we have also super abundance, which is an idea that was also pushed by Peter Diamandis and Eric Drexler and other people. So anyway, how did you get this idea to keep on moving from 2S, 3S, 4S, 5S, and do we get into 6S at some point?
Well, this is part of the experimentation. Let's try different messages and see which ones are successful. And the triple S messaging of David Pearce was made particularly popular by a video that was made by BIOPS, BIOPS, the British Institute for Posthuman Studies, about 2013, in which they talked about the triple S. And that video has probably had more positive views about transhumanism than any other single video anywhere. Now, my own view is that there is a social dimension to transhumanism as well. We are social beings, and that if we want to talk about freeing ourselves from inherited limitations, we have to talk about the inherited limitations in our social structures, as well as those in our bodies, that super longevity addresses, those in our rational mind, that super intelligence addresses, and those in our emotional setup, that super happiness addresses. We need to look at the issues in our society, our tendency to abuse power, our tendency to deceive each other, our tendency to exploit each other. It's not very nice to recognize it, but there are these tendencies there. And democracy is part of the solution, but it is clearly struggling. As Winston Churchill said, it is the worst of all political structures, apart from all the others. So it's not a ringing endorsement. So I don't think democracy by itself is going to succeed. Excuse me. I don't think democracy itself is going to succeed. We have to enhance it, and we can use technology to enhance it via super democracy, which is the fourth, which is something I've been talking about ever since one of the Transvisions about 4 or 5 years ago in France, I think, at Paris. Now, at the same time, as you pointed out, many people have used the phrase superabundance, and I think that's a very important phrase. It talks about the transformation of our relationship with the material world. It moves us away from living in terms of scarcity into living in which there is, for most things, enough for everybody, and that changes how we organize. And especially when we do this in a sustainable way. Hence the title of my 2018 book, Sustainable Superabundance. And then while pulling some slides together recently, I thought, actually, I should put the 5 S's together as an experiment, and I'll see how well that goes down. If I see other people talking about it, then I think, well, maybe it's been successful. Otherwise, I might shuffle the deck of cards again.
Now, our friend Didier Cornell from AFT Techno Prague writes that he thinks among the S's there should be something concerning empathy and or nonviolence and or peacefulness. And he wonders, David, if you have any thoughts on this.
I agree. And my definition of super happiness, which I skimmed over earlier, when I look at the longer discussion, it exactly is about being kinder and more empathetic, emphasizing that aspect of our character, which is there, but it often gets subordinated to our competitive and power abusive streak. And so in my discussion of super happiness, I look at that greater emotional maturity.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, David. And now I know Ben Ballweg has an interesting question that I would like him to pose. So Ben, please go ahead.
I'll try. I'm regarding the transhumanist shadow. I guess I feel like Christianity also has a shadow, and we just had some Christian transhumanists on last week. The shadow of like the Crusades, bigotry, etc. And I feel like Christianity has this antidote of the "What would Jesus do?" mantra to be like, well, the church is doing all this crazy crap, but to get to the root of what did Jesus originally intend us to do in treating others the right way. And I wonder if transhumanism could have a similar moral guide for us to avoid the transhumanist shadow, to show the purity that I know the transhumanist ideal does have.
So that's a great question. Now, we don't have a Jesus in transhumanism. The nearest thing we've got to a canonical document is the Transhumanist Declaration. And I do often point people at the Transhumanist Declaration when they come up with a criticism and say, oh, you transhumanists, you are X, Y, Z. I'll say, well, look at the Transhumanist Declaration. It doesn't talk like that instead. So that's the nearest thing we've got. But no, I'm open for more suggestions. I mean, we probably can't say what would the Pope of transhumanism do, because we don't have such a character. Each of the representatives of transhumanism are limited in, and none of us should be held up as in any ways infallible. We are all learning this together. But there is the possibility of finding new phrases, and so I'm open to the panel for coming up with creative possibilities here. Incidentally, I found recently a cartoon from quite a number of years ago talking about supply side Jesus versus Jesus of Nazareth, and it was a real hoot, I have to say. And humor sometimes can reach through and change people's ideas in a way that straightforward, rational discussion can't. So if we can find similar cartoons that in some way highlight our messages in a way that reach through at the humor level and then leave a powerful message behind, then that's a great thing we could accomplish.
Now, in our internal chat, Edward Hudgens suggested, perhaps a bit in jest, the phrase, what would Kurzweil do? And of course, Ray Kurzweil is a highly respected figure in the transhumanist movement, and certainly somebody who attracts people who acknowledge his contributions from a wide variety of standpoints, be they in terms of his technological innovations or his forecasts, many of which have been accurate, some of which have missed the mark largely because of social resistance rather than the technological possibilities not being present. So I'm curious, Edward, if you would like to elaborate upon that, and then we can hear David's feedback.
Yeah, I mean, I did say that in part in jest because while I respect Kurzweil, obviously, he's focusing on a lot of the technology, on being able to upload our brains and so forth. Yours, I think, is a much more nuanced and really a great understanding of how to approach and think about these issues. I'm consider myself libertarian, or in the European sense, a classical liberal. but a very reasonable one, I like to think. But that's one of the things I think we really need. One of the things that defines our movement is we shouldn't be ideologues, as you have discussed. By the way, I'll just mention something real quick that I put in the chat. We fight this battle on many fronts. Jose and I and Gennady have been at a lot of the same conferences where we talk specifically about transhumanism and singularity. But for example, I battle a lot of it here in the Washington, D.C. area in the public policy arena. And what I find that helps move people in our direction and has them actually looking a little bit more deeply is to look at specific areas where transhumanism can offer a really interesting vision they haven't thought about. For example, taking our sick care system in this country and making it into a real healthcare system. Right now, you get sick and then you discuss who is going to pay the bills. You do the same thing in Britain, has, of course, a national policy and so forth. But when you talk about the technologies and what they can do, when I talk to people about what CRISPR-Cas9 did earlier last year, turning off the production of tau proteins in the neurons in the brain, I find it doesn't matter whether they're Republican or Democrat or whatever, people listen. Oh, really? That's interesting. Or about lifelong learning, so you can robot proof yourself, so to speak. Wow, that's interesting. Tell me more. And I find that when you use these hooks, you can bring people along and they see that, first of all, we're not nuts. And then second, well, these people have interesting things to say. Maybe we should look a little bit deeper. The sort of thing Peter Diamandis does in his various books. So anyway, I'm curious about your thoughts on that as one of the approaches to promoting the transhumanist vision.
Well, it worked in my life. I read Ray Kurzweil's book, The Age of Spiritual Machines, and I had my mind raised to all kinds of things which I hadn't previously considered.
Me too.
So it does guide people. And perhaps one of the hardest parts I had to write in Vital Foresight was the bit in which I had to assess how accurate Ray Kurzweil's predictions had been. And people have very different views on this. There are the true believers who say that he almost got everything right, and other ones, there are reasons why he got them wrong. And then there are more skeptics who say that actually he had a lot that wasn't right. And I had to come down on the side that said it's by no means clear-cut. So there is no infallibility in the predictions in the books such as The Age of Spiritual Machines, all the serious near. So they can be inspiring, but I don't think the messages of transhumanism should stop there. And I want more emphasis on the uncertainties that are ahead, rather than some vision that, don't worry, we will fix the problems with poor genetic engineering by using nanotechnology. And if there are problems with nanotechnology, we'll use AI to fix that. And if there are problems with AI, well, we'll use another AI to fix that. And that's sort of nice as a general principle, but it's too glib for my views. And I think we need a more sober reflection. So Ray's messages, along with those of Peter Diamandis and others, are part of the overall transhumanist story, but they shouldn't be the only ones. And we need to have another set of messages available when people start asking more questions, and then we can convert them from initial excited but somewhat naive transhumanists into transhumanists who are actually more able to engage, as you are doing, Edward, with your remarkable work in Washington, with your recommendations on improving the FDA approval processes with innovative ideas.
Yeah. By the way, I just want to compliment you again on, you start the book out by saying what I think is exactly correct. What kind of foresights are we talking about? And we're not talking about crystal ball predictions. You're talking about perceptions, being able to perceive where things are going because we're in a complicated world, assessing both the challenges, the good sides, the possible benefits, and the dangers, and then leveraging and steering, I think is the word you use. And I think you really present an excellent a way to think about what we're doing, and especially when you're working practically in the world of ideas. So again, I want to really compliment you on the excellent book.
Thanks.
Yes, thank you, Edward, and I would echo those compliments as well. Now let us hear questions and comments from some other members of our panel. Let's start with Jason Geringer.
I was noticing that when you said somebody had accused transhumanism of XYZ, you were able to point to that transhumanist declaration. And I completely agree that is a valuable thing to have. And I agree with that we should have, like you said, more. And your presentation here is awesome. I would vote that your vital foresight be, part of a standard transhumanist, education, that it should be put alongside, that transhumanist declaration. And we also have the Transhumanist Bill of Rights. I think we should get together and have some kind of procedure where we vote on that. And these people said that that this is the declaration. That's where it serves a good purpose. And I think your vital foresight would be awesome to be in there. Would you be all right with
Sure.
with that?
It should be. I'm happy for bits of it to be published stage by stage online. I think that's already happening a little bit.
Awesome.
But if people want to point to it and say this is a book that's helpful, that's great. But I agree with your general principle. We need to collect together high quality documents or high quality videos that are accessible, which are something we can stand behind, which provide a syllabus for people of all ages to fill out their knowledge of transhumanism. And in a sense, that's what I'm trying to do with a new project called not Vital Foresight, but the Vital Syllabus. So if you look on the London Futurist site, you'll find, I think, 24 pages of a potential syllabus covering the most important things that people need to know about in the 2020s, which is different from what we learned about in school in the old days. We went to school in the old days and we learned the 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic. But there's a whole different set of skills that people need now, starting off with how to learn to learn. Right. You have to learn so many new things. And there's a lot about communications. There's a lot about emotional health. And yes, there's a lot about transhumanism and the singularity and about NBIC and so forth. And so it is my goal over the next few years to collect together existing videos, existing materials, which are already there, which can be added to that syllabus, and where necessary to create new videos that highlight things which have never adequately been committed to video before. So I'm happy to cooperate with other projects that are doing similar things, and I'm happy also for people to help me fill out that vital syllabus, the pages that are there.
That sounds very interesting.
Yes, absolutely. And Edward also agrees in our internal chat that we need to develop and promote an education curriculum for transhumanism. And Ugo Chukwu's book, An Exercise in Clear Thinking, that I've read as well, and I have reviewed, and we had Ugo Chukwu as our guest at a previous Virtual Enlightenment Salon, is highly recommended. But yes, I have encouraged Jason, who is compiling a lot of our educational materials for the U.S. Transhumanist Party members, to include the videos from the Vital Syllabus among those educational materials, and then have USTP-specific videos complementing the more general transhumanism education that David Wood's Vital Syllabus provides. And of course, we're going to utilize other content as well where it fits with the kinds of values and understanding of transhumanism that we seek to cultivate in our members, especially the new ones who are seeking to learn about transhumanism. We want them to have an accurate and nuanced understanding. Now let's go to Art Ramon Garcia.
Yeah, I have an observation. Richard Hart, who organized the SENS Research Foundation fundraiser, the Pulse Chain airdrop. He raised $27 million with this fundraiser when he worked, with the Sins. And when I watch his YouTube live streams, he never says the T word for transhumanism or the L word for life extension or the A word for, anti-aging. Instead, he says medical charity. So any insight into why he's avoiding using a more proper term?
So this is part of the diversity of messaging. Different messages can be appropriate in different places. One of the most influential transhumanist political groups in the world completely avoids using that term. They describe themselves, they're German, they describe themselves as, I think, the Party for Health Research. And they only have a single policy, which is that more money should be dedicated from the national budget to research the diseases of aging. So individuals there are sympathetic to transhumanism, but they don't want to complicate their messaging by bringing in all these other things. Aubrey de Grey, also the pioneer at Sense, generally avoids talking about transhumanism in public discussions. He wants to emphasize health. So for him, H plus, if anything, means health plus. And that also makes sense for particular audiences. I do think, however, that people will figure out, these technologies which are going to help us be healthier, they're not just going to stop there, are they? They're not just going to help us live the same as we're doing now for more decades. They're going to change other aspects of life as well. Where is it going to lead to? What's the implications going to be? And at that stage, that's where we have to have the transhumanist messages ready to say, well, we have thought about that, and here is what we think the answer should be. So let's celebrate Richard Hart and Aubrey de Grey and others who are doing great works without always mentioning transhumanism, but we must be ready to compliment them when the time arises.
Yes, indeed. And I think the task of providing complementary messaging to what is already being disseminated by these various innovators is highly important. And of course, we also are happy at our virtual enlightenment salons to give people like Aubrey de Grey a platform. We had a highly productive virtual enlightenment salon with him in February 2021, and hopefully this year we can invite him as a guest once again. And of course, with Richard Hart, who has done great philanthropic work and great fundraising work, and he has also been a strong supporter of the SENS concepts. We would be thrilled to have him as a guest sometime in the future as well. So now let us go to David Shoemaker. David, what questions or comments do you have for David Wood?
Yes, excellent timing, Gennady. I think Art Ramon's question leads into something that I want to talk about, and that's fragmentation, and going back to the transhumanist shadow. So the question starts out like this. Transhumanism is a small community, and the human shadow seems to invoke fragmentation. We were talking about religion earlier. So if you take Christianity, there are many, many different denominations of Christianity. It's spread out, split, fractioned over time. I think that some of the different aspects of transhumanism tend to follow along the ideals that you laid out, as well as the shadows that you laid out. How do we keep from becoming fractionalized based on our different approaches, what we think is most important? And what are the dangers of that happening?
It's a great question. Indeed, the human characteristic in, we might call them radical organizations, is to split, as was the feature in Monty Python's Life of Brian, when it had lots of fun at the schisms within the various different political groupings at the time of that film. And it's true, religious groups often fragment, political groups often fragment, and we have to fight that tendency. We have to rise above it. We have to support diversity, but not at the cost of hating each other or despising each other or working against each other in the way that sometimes happens in politics and religion, when it seems that the biggest enemy of the extreme left in Britain seems to be the centre of the Labour Party rather than Boris Johnson. As you may have seen, the former British Prime Minister Tony Blair received in the New Year's Honours List a knighthood, a member of the Garter. And some of the extreme left or the mainstream left in the Labour Party are more upset by that than anything that the right-wing politician who's a Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, is doing. So we must not fall foul ourselves to that kind of schisms, and we must therefore seek to practice true transhumanism, which is putting our ideological divisiveness on hold, figuring out ways in which we can cooperate rather than just being affronted by some things that we might say. After all, there's a wide diversity of people on this call, and we by no means all agree about all issues, but we don't let these differences of opinion fragment our ability to work together. That's hard, and we have to keep working on it. So let's keep reminding ourselves of the importance of building bridges rather than burning bridges and creating schisms.
Yeah, thank you, David.
Yes, absolutely. And I would definitely agree with those remarks, both from David Shoemaker and David Wood. And Mike DeVerde notes that David Shoemaker has perceived a crucial issue. In our YouTube chat, I did respond to a question from Daniel Twett, who wondered how many sects does transhumanism have? And my answer is the situation is too fluid to really delineate or quantify in a reliable, time-invariant manner. But I do think with the U.S. Transhumanist Party, we have actually allowed for some coalescing to occur. As I pointed out earlier, we did successfully absorb the Transhuman Party and the Longevity Party, and there was previously the Transhuman National Committee of the United States. And although that organization did not work out, we continue to actively collaborate with people who held prominent roles in that organization. Right now, a lot of them are on the Uplift team, for example. And I think the reason why we have been able to at least diminish the fragmentation is because of our big tent approach, because we are inclusive of a multiplicity of perspectives. We have venues like the Virtual Enlightenment Salons, which allow for thoughtful conversations among people with diverse viewpoints to occur. Now let us go to Celeste Castaldo for her questions and comments.
Hi, Happy New Year's, everyone, and thank you, David, for the great presentation and the work you're doing. I had a question. So I was reading about yesterday on New Year's some religious views about artificial intelligence, and I was specifically trying to look up whether any of the religions thought that an artificial intelligence could have a soul. That was what I was researching. And so I actually found some literature that was regarding Christianity, and that they had supported in the article that they thought that Christianity would support AIs being able to receive a God-given soul, since they believed that God had unlimited ability. And so I thought maybe I would be interested to hear about your thoughts on that.
Well, I think the point is that religions can evolve and change too, and that ideas which once upon a time might seem completely strange and alien to religious groups can become adopted as they see new technological possibilities and as they see new philosophical ideas. So the encouraging thing is the growth of various religious groups who are transhumanists, such as the Christian Transhumanist Association of Micah Redding and others, such as the Mormon Transhumanism, such as various Buddhist transhumanist groups. And they will be open to dialogue with us, provided we in turn are open to dialogue with them, rather than disdaining them and somehow saying, oh, no, you're religious, we can't talk to you. On the contrary, as Janari was saying, we should be the big tent rather than having lots of sects and divisions within transhumanism. It's more a matter of having different flavors which can work together.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much, David. And thank you also to Mike DeVerde for your kind comments in our YouTube chat. Mike DeVerde writes that the Big Tent approach has been excellent. And definitely this is an approach that we aim to continue into 2022 and well beyond. Of course, as our last Virtual Enlightenment Salon of 2021, we had Micah Redding of the Christian Transhumanist Association and his colleague Jonathan Gunnell joining us. And I hope in 2022 for at least one of our salons to have representatives from the Mormon Transhumanist Association. I know they have a lot of formidable thinkers, including Lincoln Cannon and Carl Youngblood and various others as well. And they are a very cohesive organization. Their level of internal logistical acumen is quite impressive. And I think an aspect that we could learn from within the broader transhumanist community. Now, as our last question, I think this is an extremely important one raised by Mike Lazine. How do we stop Hollywood from using transhumanist themes and sometimes demonizing those of us who are true transhumanists? Because as we know, Hollywood likes to present a riveting dystopian tale very often, and it's more difficult, as we've discussed in various other virtual enlightenment salons, to create a hopeful techno-optimistic work of science fiction that maintains an audience's attention. But this kind of creativity is quite imperative if we are to overcome the negative perception of transhumanism. Hollywood is one of those sources that reaches millions, if not billions, of people. So how do we turn Hollywood more techno-optimistic and prevent the misrepresentations of transhumanism from circulating in films and other media that Hollywood generates?
I think this is going to be stage by stage. I think if we keep on creating our own literature, there will be science fiction authors who are sympathetic to transhumanism, who will write quite positive messages. And there's a lot of that happening these days. So that's encouraging. And in due course, Hollywood producers will show transhumanists who aren't all bad guys, that there are transhumanists who are good guys as well. I think briefly of a book by Dan Brown, I think it was Inferno, in which one of the apparent bad guys was a transhumanist. But it turns out, spoiler alert, that there was another character in that book as well who was also identified as transhumanist, who was clearly admirable. So sadly, that didn't make it into the film version. So over time, if we keep emphasizing a variety of interesting messages, some of the script writers will pick that up and take them into Hollywood. And of course, we should be clever and smart about criticizing things which clearly get things wrong and helping to prick people's consciences so that they are more aware and ready to do something more positive next time round.
Mm-hmm. Yes, indeed. Thank you, David, for that answer. And in our chat, Alan Crowley suggests that there could be a quite appealing story about how a person overcomes a problem like cancer, Alzheimer's, death through technology. And definitely that sets the stage for a conflict, for a lot of dramatic tension, struggle, and resolution. I think audiences like happy endings as well. So thank you very much, Alan, for that suggestion. And now, as our time draws to a close, I would just like to thank David Wood again for an immensely insightful presentation, always thought-provoking, and always leading us to perceive whatever aspect of reality David talks about in a multidimensional, interdisciplinary fashion, exactly what our virtual enlightenment salons are intended to do. Thank you so much to our panelists. Thank you to our audience. This has been a greatly engaging session with wonderful dialogue in all regards. An excellent start to the year. And until next week, every Sunday at 1 p.m. Pacific time, 4 p.m. Eastern time, live long and prosper.